Throughout the long and heralded history of Nintendo, there have been many interesting and unique franchises that have been created by their hand. Each and every one of them was highly innovative in their genres, with some even shaping their own. The Legend of Zelda pioneered the adventure genre, giving the masses a compelling story that they had never seen in gaming before. Metroid would further innovate on the platformer genre, adding horror and exploration elements into the mix. On top of all these sat Mario, everyone's favorite plumber, the character and franchise that had revitalized the platformer genre and even the gaming industry as a whole. But these were just a few of their successes. Some franchises, for a time, just got left behind. Fire Emblem was one of them. A series that starkly contrasted with the cartoony and lighthearted characters Nintendo was known for, Fire Emblem would brave new ground with a darker setting and even more devious gameplay. A brutal franchise for only the most hardcore of gamers. For a time, no one outside of Japan even knew of its existence, let alone how it was created. But with the series' rising popularity and newly christened mainstream status, maybe it's time to shed some light on the matter. A story of swords, dragons, and one man backed by an entire company begins. The story of Fire Emblem's development takes us back all the way to 1973, in the early years of Nintendo's development as a game maker. The company had decided to expand its ventures into a new frontier, electronics. To do so, they split their newly founded electronics department into three branches: R&D1, R&D2, and R&D3. Out of all of these though, R&D1 would prove to be the most prominent. Shigeru Miyamoto, the iconic Nintendo game visionary, got his start here, where he worked under Gunpei Yokoi, the eventual creator of the Game Boy. Several years after Miyamoto left due to the success of Donkey Kong, a group of R&D1 programmers formed their own company, Intelligent Systems, and was almost bought on the spot by Nintendo. This new group, under the tutelage of Yokoi, would strive to create new games that were far different from any standard Nintendo affair. Their first effort was Famicom Wars. Releasing in 1988, Famicom Wars became the first in a long line of strategy games for the company. Taking control of two warring nations, Red Star and Blue Moon, players were tasked with fighting off the enemy faction and destroying their headquarters completely. It was a standard strategy game in all but name. Now with their feet wet in the genre, the team was bent on creating a franchise worthy of their name. After Famicom Wars' release, Intelligent Systems had diverted its attention to more simulation-based games. They wanted to do something like Famicom Wars, but with a new spin on it that was wholly original. But who would craft this new masterpiece? One man would answer that call. A man by the name of Kaga. His idea was never meant to be a commercial project according to him, but he still had a vision, and with it a vast knowledge of game design to boot. Shoujo quickly put the studio to work to develop his creation. Along with him, his team would consist of game designer Tohru Naharino, characters designed by Daisuke Zuka, and the iconic music provided by composer Yuka Tsujiyoko. Unlike Famicom Wars before it, Shoujo's game would add new mechanics to differentiate itself from its predecessor and other strategy games on the market, combining the strategy and role-playing genres' inner workings to mold its own unique hybrid. There would be nothing quite like it for some time. Even though it wasn't the most technically advanced game on the NES, it was still groundbreaking in more ways than one. And on April 20th, 1990, after 2 years of hard work, Japan would be the first to understand this. Fire Emblem. Ankokuryu tu Hikari no Suguri, roughly translating as Fire Emblem Dark Dragon and Sword of Light. This was the first mainstream strategy RPG on the market. beating out other titles such as Sega's Shining Force and Super Robot Tyson for the claim. Fire Emblem also ditched the modern military setting that Famicom Wars was known for and decided to go for an environment set in medieval times, with swords, magic, and fantastical beasts throughout. Its story would follow this fantasy route too. Our lead protagonist was Marth, a prince of the nation Altea. All is well in the kingdom until the neighboring kingdom of Deluna attacks, forcing Marth to become an exile in the nation of Talis. With his sister Elise taken hostage and his father killed by the evil priest Garnif, Marth must gather an army to retake his homeland and find the sacred sword Falchion and the mysterious Fire Emblem to vanquish a resurrected Medeus once and for all. Fire Emblem was a remarkable story for its time, with few games being able to hold a candle to it. Games with stories were hard to come by at the time, but the unique battle system that Fire Emblem had was even scarcer, but it still held close to its roots in a few ways. Fire Emblem's system was similar to Famicom Wars, with battles being totally automatic and decided by offensive and defensive numbers alone on a grid-based system. But after that, it started to branch off into its own beast. Battles took place against individual units instead of huge groups of troops attacking each other. It was also less about building troops and sending them off to their deaths like in Famicom Wars, and had a deeper connection to its troops. Fire Emblem's characters were unique in their own right, and each and every one of them had their own purpose. There were your classic mages, knights, and spearmen alike, but there were also Pegasus Knights and dastardly thieves to wield at your leisure. Nearly all of them could be promoted to more powerful classes like the Dragon Knight, and leveled up with standard RPG mechanics. It was an interesting system that Shozo and his team had created, but these were not the things that Fire Emblem would truly be known for. Its difficulty would be the main reason. This difficulty was the side effect of one of Fire Emblem's creations: permadeath. Permanent death, or permadeath as it's so affectionately called, meant that when a character fell in battle, he was dead for good. There was no way to bring him or her back from the brink. This, of course, affected the story tremendously, with cutscenes changing depending on who lived or died, with some of them not appearing at all if someone was lost. Fire Emblem became a careful dance with death as you tried your very best to keep your favorite characters alive and kicking. Death wasn't the only form of difficulty, however. Enemies were ruthless in their tactics. The arena forced you to risk both life and limb for a reward. You couldn't save in the middle of a chapter, and the victory condition of every chapter required you to have Marth in the lead. Fire Emblem was one of the most difficult games of its era, and proved to be a great challenge for gamers. After the game's release, sales remained flat for a time. A new IP had just released, and no one had heard of the new kid on the block. 2 months later, with word of mouth at a fever pitch, the game was a success. A success that Nintendo wanted to replicate, but this entry would behave like many of Nintendo's other franchises. Super Mario Bros. 2, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and many more were all vastly polarizing compared to their predecessors. You either loved them or you hated them. Fire Emblem Gaiden, or Fire Emblem Side Story, released in March of '92, and was more of the same with a bunch of added twists. Instead of being a truly direct sequel, it took the side of its name to heart. Paralleling the events of the first game, Fire Emblem Gaiden follows the story of two protagonists, Celcia and Alm. Both hail from the kingdom of Sofia in the land of Valencia, that is in a constant war between the neighboring kingdom of Rigel. Dropped in between these two warring nations, it is up to these childhood friends to build their own army, save the peaceful nation of Mira, and invade Rigel to finally bring peace to Valencia. A complicated plot for sure, but Fire Emblem Gaiden was still a proud successor of the series. While many things changed, some decided to stay the same. Comparing battles between the first two games, it wouldn't be hard to mistake one for the other, but a deluge of RPG elements would try to help it stand on its own. Instead of a whole slew of battles spread across a linear world map, Gaiden introduces a navigatable world, where each step represents a new location, such as classic Fire Emblem battles, as well as town exploration, similar to other iterations of the genre. The battle system changed around too, with characters now being able to attain different classes, Difficulty was ramped up even more than before, and permadeath was as brutal as ever. If you lost enough units at a certain point, you couldn't even complete the game, something that many people found out the hard way. Fire Emblem Gaiden was even tougher to beat than the original Fire Emblem, and that was saying something. Somehow, even amongst all of this, Fire Emblem Gaiden had managed to outsell its predecessor, shaking the second game curse that had plagued many Nintendo games before it. Intelligent Systems had a winner on its hands. A company that had formed from just a group of close colleagues had grown into its own, competing on the level of many of the Nintendo greats. The creation, Fire Emblem, was innovative for its time, molding the tactical RPG genre into what it is today. But its story and characters are what helped it stand out in a crowd of knockoffs and copycats. There was nowhere to go but up for this company, and its new proud vision. It was time to go super. After the success of Fire Emblem Gaiden, Intelligent Systems finally felt it was time to move on from the Famicom to Nintendo's brand new Super Famicom. Having come out the same year as the original Fire Emblem, it was a surprise that the franchise was as much of a hit as it was, a testament to its quality in more ways than one. Since many people could have possibly missed out on the first entry, let alone the entire franchise itself, Intelligent Systems took the route that few developers take and decided to start from the ground up with a fresh take on their first outing. Fire Emblem Mansho no Nazo, or Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, releasing in 1994, was more of the same Fire Emblem fans had come to love, but with its own innovations. Mystery of the Emblem was a remake and a sequel in one package, splitting into books 1 and 2. Each was developed with complete independence from one another, even featuring completely different soundtracks for each other. While the Super Famicom was, of course, a more powerful system, it still didn't have the power to feature basically two complete games on one cartridge, so cuts had to be made. 5 complete chapters and 6 characters unfortunately had to be cut away to make room for Book 2. But that's not to say that the game was lacking for content. No, it was actually bursting from the seams with it. Book 1 followed Shadow Dragon's story to a T, with some exceptions of course. Book 2, on the other hand, was a direct continuation of the story, with characters new and old reuniting to slay a dragon and save the kingdom once again. Even though this entry compromised the original story, everything else within it made up for that. Graphics were significantly upgraded from their 8-bit counterparts, allowing units to differentiate themselves from one another more effectively. Gameplay, in the end, proved to be the most significant improvement of them all. Taking many of the ideas Fire Emblem Gaiden had created, Mystery of the Emblem added those and its own ideas into the mix. Colored tiles helped the player understand where and how each unit would move in battle. Each weapon was crafted to look vastly different from each other, adding even more personality into the story. Units that had a horse or Pegasus were even able to dismount from their mounts, negating their weaknesses while creating new ones. The first implementation of the support system also made its way to this entry, in which units perform better in combat when they're near friends, family, or loved ones. Overall, battles were much faster and fancier than previous iterations, and it would only be improved on over time. Mystery of the Emblem proved to be a fantastic leaping off point for the series, with its popularity growing faster by the day. After some time, it would actually become the most successful Fire Emblem game of all time in Japan, trouncing even modern entries by selling nearly 750,000 copies, a feat reserved for most mainstream Nintendo titles, a feat that Fire Emblem had earned. But before we could move on to the next entry, the series did what many other series have done, and created a few side projects. The first of these were manga adaptations of the series. Each told the full stories of the games, with added-in content for context on the matter at hand. There were even 2 separate series for Shadow Dragon at the time. But with the inclusion of manga, of course, came anime. Created in 1996, this OVA, coming out with only 2 pilot episodes, would tell the story of the original Fire Emblem all over again, but with added flashbacks to flesh out Marth's origin story even more. Oddly enough, with literally no word of mouth and an international release of Fire Emblem not even considered yet, these short few episodes made their way over to America, exposing an entirely untapped audience to the series. Something even stranger than this was Fire Emblem's first and most bizarre spin-off title, BS Fire Emblem, or Fire Emblem Akane Saga, releasing in 1997 for the equally baffling Satellaview, which was an add-on for the Super Famicom. This complex little device allowed the Super Famicom to receive satellite signals from the Wow Wow station in Tokyo, and with a monthly subscription fee, you would be allowed to download new games right to your console. Fire Emblem Akane Saga took advantage of these by giving players 4 new maps to choose from. Taking place in between the events of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, players were given even more Fire Emblem content than they could ask for. This was only to satiate the crowd's hunger for a new mainline Fire Emblem title, however. That would come soon enough, but the creator of Fire Emblem, post-Kaga, wanted to try something different for the next entry. He wanted to break away from the Arcanian setting to something new with the series, similar yet contrasting with Gaiden. One of Kaga's primary aims while crafting the scenario for the project was to produce a sweeping historical epic where the world undergoes great change over periods of time. Kaga wished to convey how many historical events and behaviors are unpalatable by modern standards as a key theme, and to a lesser extent how people's mistakes ended up changing the world. In this, he was determined not to whitewash history, and sought to present a medieval drama reflective of the true nature of the era, and to present both the heroes and the villains of fighting for their own justice, to emphasize the dangers posed by branding a conflict a holy war on either side. This holy war turned out to be the name too. Fire Emblem Seisen no Kefu, or Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, releasing in 1997, was by far the most innovative Fire Emblem title in history. Taking the sweeping historical epic to heart, the game's story, while originally meant to be split into 3 parts, was made into 2 chapters. Genealogy of the Holy War is set on Jugdral, a land whose rulers bear the holy bloodlines of the 12 Crusaders. The game is split up into 2 halves, each separated by the time span of a generation. In the first generation, while most of his nation's army is off to war in the eastern nation of Isak, Lord Sigurd defends the duchies of Grandvale from a sudden invasion by the neighboring kingdom of Verdane, but is rapidly embroiled in a conspiracy against his father, Vylon, in the events which ultimately lead to the birth of the Grandvale Empire, and in the machinations of the Lopterians to create a human vessel for their Dark Lord, Lopter. The same tyranny fought by his son Silef 17 years later in the second generation. This was the key to Genealogy's story. In the first generation, each of the units, save a few, is able to pair off with each other to have children that would go on to be the protagonists of the second generation. Being able to pair off each unit also factors into the child's abilities. Depending on the father, different combinations yield different results. Above all, you had to make sure each character survived until the end, otherwise a substitute character would replace their offspring. The idea of lineages and offspring changed how you played Fire Emblem ever so slightly. One of the core tenets of Genealogy was the legacy of the 12 Crusaders, famous fighters from a time gone by. These people, of course, have their own descendants with the ability to wield a holy weapon associated with them. Coming in 2 forms, Minor and Major Blood, both offered significant stat boosts to a character. Gameplay was at the forefront of all of this, and post-Kaga did much to relate this with the scenario he had planned. Genealogy's maps were made into huge, sprawling affairs in an attempt to change the impression delivered by prior games that the conflict was being fought on a small scale. Instead, it emphasized the game's events as a massive, world-changing conflict. And while the maps became bigger and better, the combat system also improved along the way. Genealogy introduced skills into the mix, abilities processed by units that could change the course of a battle. You could even pass them down to the children, adding further customizability. Weapons had a general durability of 50 uses. After this, they break. However, while in other Fire Emblem games you would never be able to use them again, this time around you can repair them for a fee. This fee, and, well, money in general, is unique to each unit, in a bid to force players to balance out their characters. Everyone earned their own keep. Weapons were also a rarity. and without maintaining and trading them around like this, you could run out of them. Last but not least, the weapon triangle system completely revolutionized and changed how you played, a rock, paper, scissors mechanic. It consisted of 2 triangles, one for physical attacks and one for magical attacks. Swords beat axes, axes beat lances, lances beat swords. You always had to pair up the right weapon with the right opponent, otherwise you could suffer disastrous results. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War was, and still is according to many, the greatest Fire Emblem title ever made. Its gameplay innovations with the weapon triangle system, skills, and much more, along with the sweeping historical drama scenario that Kaga had made, formed together a quite formidable entry. To improve on this seemed like an impossibility, to say the least. But Kaga and his team would try their very best. Their answer would come not 2 years after Genealogy's release, Fire Emblem Thracia 776. Releasing originally in 1999 through Nintendo Power and later in 2000 as a formal cartridge, this entry would take advice from Gaiden and tell its own side story. Featuring Leaf, one of the many possible children, Thracia 776 takes place between chapters 5 and 6 of Genealogy. And we won't say anything else because it would spoil the story of Genealogy, but we do recommend playing it. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, where Thracia innovated the most was, like Genealogy, its gameplay. While skills and the weapon triangle remained, Thracia added weapon ranks. Previously introduced in Genealogy as static and based on a class, Thracia implemented the version that would become the mainstay of the series. Ranks that increase through newfound weapons and by weapons gaining their own separate experience. The game also introduced a couple other systems, rescue, capture, and fog of war. It allowed higher ranked units to rescue others from harm or have them leave the battle entirely at the cost of some penalties to their stats. Exclusive to Thracia and a more recent Fire Emblem venture is the capture mechanic, an offensive version of rescuing in which units can overpower and seize enemies rather than killing them outright. You could then steal their weapons, let them go, or simply hold on to them to possibly recruit some extra units. Another mainstay mechanic became the fog of war, a weather state that hinders your visibility of the battlefield. When it is in full effect, allied units have a limited range of vision and can't see anything outside of it, creating a sense of uncertainty and caution, as enemies are invisible until they walk right into your path. Fatigue also contributed to this sense of caution you required. Every time a unit performs an action, they gain fatigue. Use them too much and they won't be available for the next chapter. Speaking of chapters, there were concepts for those too. Gaiden chapters were side stories that you could only get after fulfilling certain conditions, and escape chapters forced you to flee while fighting for your lives. These helped along what Thracia 776 would be famous for. Hailed by many as the most difficult Fire Emblem ever created, the game would show you no mercy whatsoever. Enemies and their tactics were brutal in execution, forcing you to carefully plan out each of your moves and have your tactics at near perfection. Some other difficulty raisers include some of the most intricately crafted maps in franchise history, dismounting proving to be a hindrance rather than being helpful, and the game flat out not telling you anything. In the end, this was a game meant for the fans. Combined with a release far exceeding the lifetime of the console, alluded to the fact that this would not sell that well at all. In fact, it may just be the worst-selling entry in the franchise, period. It may have even led to the departure of Shozo Kaga, who had guided the hand of the series from the very beginning. It all started with the release of the Nintendo 64. Back when everyone was getting hyped up for this new console, and Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War had just released, fans were clamoring for an entry on Nintendo's shiny new console. Kaga would deny the claim, wishing to continue on with the Super Famicom system and return to Arcania with the higher level of strategy in tow. However, not a year later, Shigeru Miyamoto would announce that a game would release on the console in 1998. The following year, Kaga revealed that his plans for a proper return to Arcania had fallen through. If it had properly been released, Fire Emblem 64 would have been renamed Fire Emblem Ankoku no Miko, or Fire Emblem Maiden of Darkness for the now failed Nintendo 64 DD. His plans falling through, among many other unknown reasons, would force Kaga to leave his beloved franchise behind forever. He would then form his own company, Turnanog, and create his own true successor to Fire Emblem, Emblem Saga. But with its creator gone and a AAA status at risk, the future looked grim for the Fire Emblem series, and Kaga wasn't out of this mess yet. After his departure from the Fire Emblem series, Kaga founded his own company, Turnanog, and with it created his latest masterpiece, the then titled Emblem Saga. It was his spiritual successor to the franchise, one with similar turn-based gameplay, graphical and musical tones, and even an interface that seemed a bit too similar to Fire Emblem. The story was also very similar to Kaga's previous work on Gaiden, following two protagonists with two different armies of their own that intersect at a few points during the game. It was a return to old-school Fire Emblem, a return that was too comparable to the original in the eyes of Nintendo. This was because Emblem Saga wasn't due for a release on a Nintendo console, but rather Sony's shiny PlayStation. Being a direct competitor and market rival to the Nintendo 64, Nintendo did not want a series to go against Fire Emblem and possibly succeed in the long run. Prior to its 2001 release, Nintendo put legal pressure on Turnanog, as they were unhappy that Kaga was making an extremely similar game with an extremely similar title, stating they felt that this was used deliberately for promotional purposes and would bring false recognition to users. Essentially, Nintendo was worried that gamers would think that this was the next Fire Emblem game. Not wanting to get into a legal battle, Kaga agreed to change the game's name to Tear Ring Saga, and removed any and all Fire Emblem references a month before release. But Nintendo still wouldn't have any of that, and in the end still sued Turnanog and its publisher Interbrain for copyright infringement to the tune of $2 million at the time. They then went through a legal battle that lasted for nearly 4 years, at first ending in a win for Kaga, but then into a loss, forcing the company to pay nearly $700,000 by the end of it. The legal issues seemed to ruin Kaga and his dream at a new franchise. After releasing a sequel to Tear Ring Saga in 2005 called Berwick Saga, the franchise and Kaga himself seems to have disappeared from the public eye for good. Unless his new project, which is currently slated for a 2016 release, Vestiria Saga, has anything to say about that. But even with Kaga out, Fire Emblem wasn't done yet. Oh no! It was on the rise from here. This rise was propelled by the series' entrance into the ever-popular Super Smash Bros. Franchise, a fighting series that pits Nintendo's greatest against each other. The iconic Marth had been considered a prime candidate ever since the original Smash. Masahiro Sakurai, the franchise's creator, sought to add him from the beginning of development of their new game, Super Smash Bros. Melee. In tandem with this, the team also added a clone character of Marth, Roy, the star of the recently cancelled Fire Emblem 64, and the star of the next project that was forthcoming. Their inclusion in the series would shake the foundations of the entire Fire Emblem franchise, but the aftershocks wouldn't be felt for years to come. Before we learned of what would come of that, the next entry in the series came around. Formed together by the recently cancelled Fire Emblem 64, it would take a new direction from the one that Kaga had led. First, they needed to find a new director to lead the franchise, and they found him in Tohru Narihiro, a veteran programmer who had been with the franchise from the very beginning. With their leader settled on, the team decided to choose a new platform for their next venture. No longer would Fire Emblem be stuck in the past and stay on consoles that have long since lost their luster. Now, Fire Emblem's new home would be in the palm of your hand. The Game Boy Advance, releasing in 2002 as the newly titled Fire Emblem Fuin no Suguri, or as it's officially called, Fire Emblem The Binding Blade. This would be a return to the more simplistic storytelling of the originals. Following the exploits of the titular Roy, the game is set in a new and separate world from its predecessors, the continent of Elib, a land once wrecked by a fierce war between humans and dragons. 1,000 years after the conflict, the misanthropic King Zafil of the militarist nation of Bern has freed the infamous Demon Dragon and engaged the rest of Elib in a full-scale war with the intent of freeing the world from mankind and returning it to its rightful dragon owners. In response, Roy, the young heir of Fere, leads the forces of Lycia in combating Bern in lieu of his ill father, Marquez Eliwood. While Fire Emblem was no longer helmed by the series visionary Kaga, it and its subsequent iterations were still able to tell a story that resonated with the Fire Emblem faithful, in large part because of one of its leading design ideas was to feel similar, yet distinct from the original Arcania series of games. This can be seen in its map design, handful of characters, and even the motivation of the main villains. Kaga's use of a relatively gray moral setting with no clear-cut visage of good versus evil was still at the forefront, even though the series had changed hands. However, the differences are what really made the Binding Blade stand out from its predecessors rather than its similarities. Whether it was a step back or step forward in the franchise was ultimately up to the players and ultimately the fans' opinions. As a defining example, the franchise's trademark strategy gameplay differed from its predecessor. While Thracia 776 had one of the greatest difficulty curves in all of Fire Emblem, Binding Blade didn't have as much complexity in comparison, whether it be in terms of storytelling or gameplay. While it is considered one of the more challenging games in the Fire Emblem series in the modern day, despite its simplicity, its latest predecessor left a huge chip on its shoulder for longtime fans. But it did do some things right. Mostly a hidden mechanic until this entry, the support system was brought to center stage. Equivalent to the love system without the love, supports happen in a similar way when characters talk to each other on the battlefield. Each support grants certain bonuses to your units, and as they grow up in support rank, they can eventually get married like in Genealogy, but without the children. This system allowed for a greater level of insight and depth into your army members of lesser importance, and made them all the more memorable, compared to prior installments where they were, by and large, left flat and unfleshed out. The flow of the battle also differed from previous entries. Certain stat changes and reworks were made, and an affinity system gave each unit one of 7 elemental affinities to dictate what support bonuses they would give to their partner. The weapon triangle was also tinkered with ever so slightly. Leaving the physical triangle alone, their focus was on the magical triangle, where they combined fire, thunder, and wind magic into anima magic, while keeping light and dark the same, creating the trinity of magic that was used for many years. Fire Emblem The Binding Blade was also the first in the series to include a rudimentary form of multiplayer where you can fight against another player's army. Incidentally, this feature had been one that Kaga had wanted to include from the very beginning. This and much more is why The Binding Blade is considered today to be the game which codified the general structure and gameplay flow of almost all subsequent Fire Emblem games. Many considered this to be the turning point in the down spiral, but no one can deny the influence this one game had on the future of the entire franchise, while bringing it back from the brink. If only the next entry could rectify its mistakes. But the world had plans for Fire Emblem, big ones. When Super Smash Bros. Melee was being localized in the West, their team was faced with deciding whether or not Marth and Roy should come with the game. No one in the West really knew about the franchise, and since they spoke Japanese, no one would even be able to understand them. But they saw no harm in the matter and let them stay in. This would unknowingly change the fate of Fire Emblem forever. Fans of Super Smash Bros. Flocked to these characters, wanting to know who they were and where they came from. The popularity of Marth and Roy was large enough that Nintendo felt it was high time to release the series globally. But Super Smash Bros. Wasn't the only reason. Another came with the long-forgotten title that started it all, Famicom Wars, now releasing as the brand new Advanced Wars globally. Nintendo was excited by this, and felt that strategy games truly had a place on their new handheld. A new Fire Emblem title was incoming, and the whole world was going to play it. Fire Emblem Reikanoken, or Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, releasing in 2003 and later that year as the aptly titled Fire Emblem. This time around, the story told would be a prequel of sorts to Binding Blade, set on the same continent of Elib 20 years prior to its predecessor's events. It stars 3 main characters, Eliwood and Hector, the fathers of the Binding Blades Roy and Lilina, and a completely new character, Lyn. The game is divided into 2 segments. The first segment stars Lyn and revolves around her quest to save her grandfather from his treacherous brother, acting as a tutorial mode for the game. The longer second part stars Eliwood, Hector, and Lyn, as they oppose the schemes of the sorcerer Nergal, who wishes to summon the long-banished dragons back to Elib. As an introduction for an international audience, the world of Fire Emblem Blazing Sword was on par with its predecessor, weaving a similar story, but one that was all the more memorable. However, Blazing Sword had the shortest development cycle in series history, so it never had the time to truly set itself apart from Binding Blade in several regards. Much of its gameplay and assets in general were reused and remade. However, that doesn't mean they didn't try, and as many players in the West first vision of the series, it left a big impression onto what Fire Emblem should be. A strategy game that could develop strong side characters while also giving an entertaining story that would grasp your attention, and always has a little something more tucked underneath. The player was given a role in the story as a tactician. While you yourself don't participate in battle, you instead are the one that helps guide the armies of Lyn along with Eliwood and Hector to victory. Another little tidbit for the game was with the Japanese release. For the first time in series history, you were able to link Blazing Sword with Binding Blade, allowing for certain features to be unlocked in the new Fire Emblem. 2 epilogue scenes were unlocked from the second you beat the game, otherwise you would have to play through it 9 to 11 times. More important than either of these, however, was the ability to skip Lyn's story, basically a bona fide tutorial mode that you're forced to go through. It really had no bearing on the story at large and was certainly skippable. It was Nintendo's old philosophy rearing its ugly head again, believing that international gamers couldn't handle the difficulty at first. But players still plowed through to find an amazing story hidden underneath. And after selling nearly 1 million copies worldwide, the franchise was officially solidified globally. With that, it was time to innovate once again. This innovation came with their next entry, Fire Emblem Saima no Kosuki, or Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. Releasing in 2004 and 2005 globally, Sacred Stones is the only completely isolated title in the series, set in a completely different world from all the others. Magvul. It stars Erica and Ephraim, twin heirs to the kingdom of Renes, as they combat the sudden aggression of their southern neighbor, Grotto, and investigate the dark forces that have caused their former ally to swiftly turn on them and the rest of the continent and save the Sacred Stones from destruction. Sacred Stones was a return to Gaiden-like storytelling with separate characters working for their own goals until they meet in the end. But the hero's connection to the villain is what really drives the story forward. While the villains in past games have always had more depth to them than we realized, the villain of this story has 2 very contrasting personalities depending on which route you choose to take during the middle of the story. What makes this fascinating to many players is that his character still seems consistent even when you compare his identities side by side, making the dynamic between him and the heroes all the more stronger. This and the close connections between the cast of characters at your side leads to many pointing to the writing as its biggest strength, and for some, as some of the best Fire Emblem has to offer. This inspiration from the series past also influenced the gameplay. Several units started as a trainee class, a stage even lower than normal units. In turn, they gain experience quickly, and after reaching level 10, they can choose between 2 standard classes and become normal units during the subsequent chapter. This basically allowed those units to become a completely different class given some time, giving you further customizability than ever before. Monsters had a bigger presence within Sacred Stones. All of them had their own classes and reclasses just like your own units, but in general they usually had inferior stats to go along with that. Like Fire Emblem Gaiden, there was a world map that the player could manually traverse through. There were random skirmishes with monsters and towns aplenty for you to use at your leisure for shopping and extra experience. That too was completely changed. Every unit has an infinite amount of experience they can gain from, drastically decreasing the difficulty of the game. In fact, because of this and much more, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones may be the easiest Fire Emblem game ever made. With this change in attitude, could the franchise continue to stand the test of time, or was this path just not in the cards? After the release of Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, many fans and critics began to complain about the series' lack of innovation. Every entry in the series' Game Boy Advance era felt remarkably similar to each other, for better or worse, and because of this, it seemed that interest in the franchise was waning once again. Luckily enough for fans of the series and newcomers alike, when Sacred Stones was announced, a second Fire Emblem game was revealed along with it. Intelligent Systems decided that they should bring the series to home consoles once again, to the GameCube to be specific. They felt that this would be the shot in the arm the series needed so desperately, while also giving them room to try things the series had never done before. They would call it Fire Emblem, Soen no Kiseki, or Fire Emblem Path of Radiance worldwide. Releasing in 2005, Path of Radiance changed many aspects of the Fire Emblem series. For one, the power of the console allowed the franchise to fully enter the third dimension, with 3D character models and environments spread throughout. Transitioning from 2D graphics to 3D graphics was one of the biggest challenges during development, especially since the classic tilted overhead view was to be replaced with a unit-to-unit battle in third person. The team even used motion capture while still making the characters' motions feel a little over the top to keep that fantasy feel intact. Path of Radiance also had the series' first real cutscenes, fully animated by Japanese animation house Digital Foundry. But these would never have worked without introducing voice acting into the foray. For the past 8 Fire Emblem titles, dialogue had always been text-based. There was something missing. Voice acting was it. Path of Radiance even featured the franchise's first vocal song, Life Returns, which was of course provided by the series' iconic composer, Yuka Tsujioko. All of this combined helped to create a fantastic Fire Emblem game, but there's still so much more to it than that. Path of Radiance's story takes place on the continent of Teleus, yet another land that is separated from the whole of Fire Emblem lore. Unlike previous entries, however, Path of Radiance doesn't follow a lord as its main character, but a mercenary. Ike was his name, and what Roy of the Binding Blade was originally called. His adventure begins with his entrance into the Grail Mercenaries, a company of mercenaries led by his father, Grail. For a time, they operate normally within the borders of Crimea, a nation of humans that just rests north of Gallia, a state comprised of a new race to the Fire Emblem series called the Lagoos, humanoids capable of transforming into animals. All seems well for a time until the neighboring kingdom of Dane invades. Soon after, Ike comes across an unconscious woman in a forest that turns out to be the princess of Crimea, Elincia. Escaping to Gallia and losing his father to the Dane general, the Black Knight, in the process, Ike must now gather an army of his own to take back Crimea and defeat Ashnard, King of Dane. Interestingly enough, Path of Radiance had one overarching theme throughout: racism. Before, all of the squabbles in the Fire Emblem series were against nations of the same race. But this time there were the Lagoos, and the nation of Danes, Birak, who were always at each other's throats. It was up to Ike to break these long-held grievances and pull the world together to fight their true enemy, Ashnard. But as with everything up until this point, Path of Radiance tried its best to tweak the gameplay to its own liking. The new races were the first concept to take center stage. In battle, the Lagoos changelings had the ability to transform into various animals, from tigers to hawks. After their transformation gauge was filled, they would turn into their animal selves, losing the ability to use standard swords, axes, and armaments while switching to their more animalistic ones like claws and beaks. Your unit's biorhythm also became another important mechanic for you to maintain, a stat that affects a character's hit and avoid statistics. Biorhythm would fluctuate between chapters, either hindering or refining a unit even further. Other slight additions to how you changed classes and leveled up were also made, letting characters automatically change classes at level 21 and awarding bonus experience depending on how well you did in a chapter. The skill system along with this was created anew, with each character having a capacity gauge that allows for mastery of skills. The space of the capacity gauge varies between classes and characters, and any unit could learn any skill, although with some exceptions. Path of Radiance introduced weapon forging to the series, letting you improve weapons, change their colors, and even give them a unique name. The support system also made a comeback, but not in the way it had previously been portrayed. Support level used to be raised by putting units next to each other. However, Path of Radiance altered this by having it be determined by the number of battles 2 units had been in together. Conversations now took place at Ike's home base, a feature that had been added at the behest of the development team, as they wanted a place where characters could interact separately from the battlefield. To go along with this, conversations now had a secondary version instead of just the standard support-based ones. These new info conversations provided crucial hints on the story ahead and were marked by 3 stars. 1 star denotes conversations that provide story background, 2 stars mark conversations that provide hints on how to proceed in the coming battle, and 3 stars indicate that the conversation may yield a special ability, item, or new playable character. With all this combined, you'd think that Path of Radiance would have sold like hotcakes back in its home country history of Japan, but you'd be wrong on that front. In fact, to this day, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is one of the 3 worst sellers of the entire franchise in Japan, even beating out the infamous Thracia 776. Even series producer Toru Narihiro thought the game was 70% complete, the product of a somewhat rushed development cycle. With incredibly positive reviews and the series still selling well overseas, there must have been something wrong that just didn't click with Intelligent Systems' original audience. Starting off, their return to consoles on one of Nintendo's least successful efforts probably wasn't helping either, so the team thought that returning to it would be futile in the long run. Having created Fire Emblem titles for the past 4 years at a non-stop pace, perhaps it was time to take great care in making the next entry. Returning to the GameCube was not an option, but Nintendo already had a new console in development, codenamed Revolution. Seeing this as their first opportunity to actually boost the sales of a fledgling console instead of riding on the coattails of its success, Intelligent Systems went right to work on their next entry. Nintendo was even in support of this, increasing their staff from 100 to 200 members, with many of them coming from Path of Radiance. With all of this support behind their backs, there was no telling what would await them on release. Their combined efforts resulted in Fire Emblem Akatsuki no Megami, or Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, releasing in 2007 and 2008 worldwide for the Nintendo Wii, a continuation of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance in more ways than one. The 3D environments and cel-shaded full-motion video were back once again, with an upgraded engine and even grander scale, with hundreds of characters on screen at a time, and over 100 unique animations per character. Taking place on Tellius once again, Radiant Dawn was divided into 4 parts. Each of these is structured similarly, beginning with a prologue chapter that introduces the situation, followed by a series of chapters that is resolved with the classic endgame. Part 1 deals with Dane, a nation in shambles due to its war with the world, with many of its people being oppressed by the occupying forces of the Begnian Empire. This is where the game's new protagonist, Micaiah, comes in, who, along with her Dawn Brigade, set out to liberate the country from tyranny. Subsequent parts involve Valencia and the state of Crimea, the return of Ike and the Grail Mercenaries, and of course a finale that brings a close to the Tellius series as a whole. With a deep story just like its predecessor, there was much to love about this new entry. However, what truly helped it further stand out from the Fire Emblem crowd was its exploration of the aftermath of a war, and how the winners don't always come out on top. There was no true victor in this conflict, only casualties, which made for a thought-provoking journey that truly fit in with the Fire Emblem ethos that had been held up throughout the years. However, combat was still the same as ever, but what they didn't change, they refined. Human characters could now promote twice, resulting in 3 tiers of character classes, with the third being incredibly powerful. Each has access to their class's occult or ultimate skill, which further increases their usefulness. The Lagoos from Path of Radiance also made a return. Now they can use a new weapon called Strike to counterattack their foes, although they would be relatively weak in this state. A new Lagoos tribe in turn was also created, called the Hatari, adding wolves into the mix. The weapon system was modified as well. Knives became classified as full weapons, matching swords, axes, bows, and lances. New low-tier bronze-level weapons were introduced as well, and while they did the least amount of damage in the game and couldn't perform critical hits, they were less expensive and allowed the most uses. And bowmen were given more tools to play with, like crossbows and bowguns. Elevation and terrain became crucial aspects of the battlefield. Characters can climb to higher levels, with higher levels increasing accuracy and damage, and lower levels decreasing it conversely for marksmen-like classes. Changing the support system had been a crucial part of each entry, and Radiant Dawn was no different. It features 2 types, buddy supports and bond supports. Buddy supports increase their characters' battle stats dependent on the elemental affinity and the support level of both buddies. Unlike in previous games, characters can be buddies with any other character, but can only have one buddy at a time. Bond supports, which also appeared in Path of Radiance, are between 2 specific characters and are always present. Because any character can form a support relationship with any other character, the conversations themselves have been simplified and are based on templates, in which the initiating character makes a stock statement while inserting a recipient's name, and the recipient will respond with a general acknowledgement. The more colorful dialogue that typified the support conversations in previous installments has been for the most part transferred to the info conversations that take place between battles. Dealing with Path of Radiance, you could transfer over save data from that entry. This would help boost the stats of any recurring characters to their old counterparts, making them all the more useful. And at times, you needed it to even have a hope of surviving, as Radiant Dawn is possibly one of the most difficult Fire Emblem titles, but not of the likes of Thracia 776. This difficulty stems from multiple things, from map design to AI brutality, but many point to the various modes you could play through as the culprits. You see, generally Fire Emblem games have 3 difficulty settings: normal, hard, and lunatic. Those who weren't the most hardcore of fans would choose the normal difficulty, and go through the game easily enough. However, due to a translation error in English-speaking countries, they were changed to easy, normal, and hard. Unless you knew what was going on, most would choose to go for the normal difficulty and end up frustrated by playing the actual hard mode, artificially making Radiant Dawn out to be more difficult than it was. This translated into poor reviews for the first time in series history, with many not knowing of the changes. It was still a very challenging game, mind you, and most decided to ignore it because of that, resulting in Radiant Dawn becoming the franchise's worst seller in Japan. The story was definitely a compelling one that expanded on what Path of Radiance had laid the foundation for, and the battle system too was further refined to its sharpest edge. But the legacy that this title left behind would continue to help shape the series as it went along, even if no one was playing it. Something was wrong with the Fire Emblem series, and Intelligent Systems just couldn't pin it down. Was it the gameplay? The story? The characters? The series itself? At first, they saw only one way to solve their problems: to try something more radical and change the very foundation of the franchise to a new and original venture. Only known as the elusive Wii title, Intelligent Systems had tried to prototype a new entry in the months after Radiant Dawn's release. Intelligent Systems had thought Fire Emblem was too niche of a franchise and they needed something that would bring in a wider audience. In order to stand out from the crowd, they decided to rip out the strategy RPG roots that had previously been the very core of the Fire Emblem series, and replace it with a combination of traditional RPG and real-time strategy elements. You could even roam around in fields, towns, and dungeons unencumbered by the grid-based system of old, with enemy encounters happening in real time. The elusive Wii title might have been the most ambitious Fire Emblem entry since Genealogy of the Holy War, but that wasn't meant to be its fate. It was an experimental project through and through, and was only killed off because of their loss of motivation after finding that they had no true aim or objective. Once it was shelved, Intelligent Systems was told to forgo console-based Fire Emblem titles for good, and try something a little different. For them, looking back to their very origin was the answer. With their efforts on consoles deemed a failure in the eyes of Nintendo, Intelligent Systems had to prove themselves once again. If the Fire Emblem series kept failing financially time and time again, it was possible the plug would be pulled for good. So, since the Game Boy Advance titles had sold so well, the team thought it would be best to return to handhelds and turn their heads to the brand new Nintendo DS. Before anyone could answer that, however, Fire Emblem once again made its triumphant return in the Super Smash Bros. Series with Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Marth came back as the series' titular character, of course, but Roy was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the more recent Ike was added and given his very own moveset that made him less of a simple clone to Marth. Even though the rest of the world's love of Fire Emblem was waning, director of the Super Smash Bros. Series, Masahiro Sakurai, still had great admiration for the franchise after all these years. Fire Emblem was now a mainstay of the series, but it was still unknown if this would at all help the franchise's diminishing returns. But what direction should they take the series in? Should they try to innovate and change their very nature like they thought to do with the elusive Wii title? Or was a reboot in order? In actuality, it turned out to be a return to what made the series what it is today. Franchise producer Tohru Narihiro thought it would be best that they should remake the original Fire Emblem from the ground up and introduce a new audience to this old tale. His team sought to draw from the NES version as much as possible. According to Narihiro, the volume of content and the length of the scripts had increased vastly since the beginning, and a simpler story could prove to be a boom for the series. Even Marth, the titular character of the series, was slightly redesigned to fit their new approach, but only so much as not to make the character unrecognizable. Either way, it was time for them to try and regain the success they once had. Their final version was Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, releasing in 2009 for the Nintendo DS. In all aspects, it was the same story as before, but with some slight additions. Just like the original, it told the story of Marth and his quest to reclaim his homeland of Altea from the evil priest Garnif, and to slay the dragon Medeus, with the Fire Emblem and Falchion in hand. But, unlike the old Mystery of the Emblem from the Super Famicom era, Shadow Dragon had every single chapter and character from the original along for the ride. And to further flesh out the plot, Marth was given a 4-chapter prologue to put his adventure into perspective. Gaiden chapters returned as well, adding never-before-seen side content to the adventure. But because of the Nintendo DS's dual-screen capabilities, Intelligent Systems was also able to finally implement another one of Shozo Kaga's ideas for the first game. This came with the introduction of custom artwork for each cutscene, giving them more emotion than the standard conversations could hope to achieve. However, there were still more changes to the original to be had. A new graphical style was present, fusing 2D and 3D into one intriguing mesh. The weapon triangle system that had become a staple of the franchise was of course put into play, changing the course of how many older battles were won. A new class swap feature was created as well, which allowed characters to change classes from, say, a knight to a mercenary, with several special classes such as lords and thieves exempted. Nearly all of the innovations from the title succeeding the original Fire Emblem made it into this entry, all culminating in a series first, Wi-Fi battles. Via Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, players could challenge their friends and random players from around the world to 5-on-5 matches. Victory was determined by either defeating the opposite army or capturing their flag, so players had to plan out their strategies even more so, as now they had real, live, and unpredictable human beings to contend with. The impact of this implementation wouldn't be felt for some time. When looking at all of this, it seems that Shadow Dragon was a near-perfect remake of the original with all of the new bells and whistles the series had come up with over the years, although it was missing something that had become crucial to many of the Fire Emblem faithful: support conversations. Fans had come to love the little tidbits and insight that they learned from these over the years, making characters that they never would have given a second thought to care about all the more memorable. With the exception of Marth and a few key players, you wouldn't understand who these characters are, let alone their motivations. This absolutely destroyed the game in the eyes of some fans, with many proclaiming it to be the worst Fire Emblem ever created, even when it was a nearly by-the-books remake of the original. This was not the reception that the team at Intelligent Systems had hoped to gain with their simpler storytelling style. There had to be something, anything that they could do to earn the trust back from their fans, and so they decided to remake, or rather retell, a story that was always an extension rather than its own beast. That beast was Fire Emblem, New Mystery of the Emblem, Heroes of Light and Shadow, a remake of Book 2 of the Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. Releasing in 2010 in Japan alone, the first title to do so in years, New Mystery of the Emblem attempted to flesh out the forgotten sequel of the original while also adding in sought-after features, such as support conversations that were missing from Shadow Dragon. This brand new yet familiar tale follows Marth, 1 year after the War of Shadows in the current War of Heroes against a newly resurrected Medeus. However, he is not alone in this effort. While of course there is his own army of heroes, both new and old, a new secondary protagonist who had been lost to the annals of history takes center stage: you, referred only as the Hero of Shadow. This new character, or My Unit as the game lovingly titles it, is a fully customizable avatar for the player to inhabit, with the ability to choose to be male or female. You even had your own prologue and Gaiden chapters dedicated to your own story and mission, with previously unobtainable units from titles such as BS Fire Emblem becoming available. In total, nearly 81 characters were recruitable, making it the largest roster of Fire Emblem characters ever created, a fact that remains true to this very day. But there were still several other additions that changed the Fire Emblem formula. For instance, DLC was introduced, a first for the series and many mainline Nintendo titles. With the Assassin's expansion, players had even more reasons to continue with New Mystery of the Emblem weeks after release. However, in a decision that changed Fire Emblem forever, casual mode was made a part of the series. This mode took away one of Fire Emblem's main selling points, and for some, crucial gameplay mechanics: permadeath. a feature that had been boasted about ever since the very first Fire Emblem. Now, players had the ability to turn it off and regain their lost units after each battle, drastically changing the flow of battle and possibly the point of it all. Since the characters of Fire Emblem had always been so personable and well written, the games had always forced you to think wisely about your actions, whether it was a fight or simply moving your units one space. This issue tore apart the Fire Emblem community. The faithful found it to be blasphemous, destroying any and all semblance of difficulty, while others were finally able to play the franchise they had so desperately wanted to after all these years. It was definitely a toss-up, and one that not only racked the community, but the developers themselves with guilt. Many of the developmental staff worried that it destroyed everything that characterized Fire Emblem. It created a type of security where your characters were prevented from dying so you didn't have to redo anything while still retaining the same essential game. While this polarized fans, the reception wasn't that great either. Sales had only slightly increased over these two entries, and it just showed no sign of improving. Nintendo saw this as well and was looking over the shoulder of Intelligent Systems, wondering if the franchise was even worth it anymore. But before pulling the plug forever, Nintendo decided to give them one last chance to save the franchise they love. If they didn't pour their hearts and souls into the project and make the ultimate culmination of the series' efforts, they would surely meet their own fate. Seeing as their next venture could prove to be their very last one, Intelligent Systems decided to bring out all the stops and create the best Fire Emblem title they could possibly make. To do so, they attempted to bring together as many Fire Emblem veterans they could to make the game a success. Tohru Narihiro, who had taken over the position that series creator Shozo Kaga led for so many years, continued to lead the team as producer of the series, guiding them with the knowledge he had been collecting from the very beginning of the entire franchise. By his side was Masahiro Higuchi, a fellow veteran from the days of Genealogy of the Holy War, who had decided to take the lead as project manager. Kohei Maeda, a writer for the series since Binding Blade and director since New Mystery of the Emblem, and Hitoshi Yamagami, another franchise staple producer who had been with the series ever since Blazing Sword, the first Fire Emblem in the West. However, the creators of this new entry weren't just old-timers. Some new blood was injected into the series as well to update its look to a more modern sensibility. The creative duo to pull it off would be comprised of Toshiyuki Kasakihara as art director, charged with bringing the world and its many characteristics to life, along with Kozaki Yusuke, who had previously worked on the Fire Emblem trading card game as the character designer. Tasked with bringing nearly 60 characters to life with their own personalities and quirks, together all of these developers and the many people who worked under them were set to make the best Fire Emblem title possible, internally called Fire Emblem Finn, Children from the Brink. But now, how would they do it? At the outset of the project, they tried throwing a number of ideas at the wall and seeing what would stick. They made proposals that were a complete departure from the series. Yamagami suggested that they take it into a wildly different direction, a modern world setting with a bit of a fantasy edge, in a bid that he called Fire Emblem 2011. Other ideas that popped into their heads ranged from this to even setting the story on Mars. But the team knew what experimentation had nearly done to the franchise before with the elusive Wii title, so in the end, they decided on something that made practical sense. A culmination of the entire series as a whole. If they were going to go down, why not make it a celebration of everything that they had created? To do so, they would put in nearly all of the concepts and innovations from Fire Emblem's past. No idea was too big or difficult for them to implement, and even as the work began to pile up, everyone was still smiling and having fun. As this admiration grew for this entry in the hearts and minds of the creators, it too became a major theme along with the bonds that they shared. Various systems from the series past were put into play along with new ones that followed this philosophy. The support system that had played a part in the series ever since the Binding Blade was combined with the love system all the way back from Genealogy of the Holy War to make their own unique system that would also further along the story. Bonds as well become an important aspect of gameplay with the new duel system, otherwise known as the pair-up mechanic, which allowed two units to work in unison with each other. This caused many fears within the development team, wondering if they broke the gameplay flow, but after some time it was felt that the system encouraged multiple playstyles for different players. But both of these systems concerned the love and bonds that their characters and in turn the players would develop. So, to make them all the more relatable, voice acting made its return to the series. The developers thought it would make the characters easier to imagine, although it was thought that if they voiced their lines in full it might conflict with the pace of it all, so this time they went for rapid-fire lines that would evoke an atmosphere of sorts. Among other things that they sought to bring back was casual mode, a controversial mode from New Mystery of the Emblem which shuts off the franchise's staple, permadeath. It was still a hotly debated issue that still affected some, but many had grown to see it as a device that encouraged newcomers to join the series, people who would never have dared play it before. Though, now they would give 3 difficulties as a sort of volume slider where you could pick and choose the way you wanted to play. Cutscenes would also play a larger role than ever before. They would have their own unique styling compared to their predecessors and were made to create a sense of grandeur and spectacle. They were inspired by the openings of the Taiga drama historical series, a famous television event in Japan. Animated by the brand new Studio Anima with full-blown motion capture technology, these cutscenes helped make the world and its characters come alive in crucial moments of the plot. But with all these components in mind, how were they going to change and better what Fire Emblem fans had always come to the series for? The gameplay. At first, the development team started by recreating the very first map in the franchise's history. They toyed with the idea of switching between 16x16 and 24x24 pixel characters, depending on the camera's overhead distance. However, as time went on, they sought to use the Nintendo 3DS's ability to render 3D models effectively, to change between an overhead classic 8-bit style and a newer one akin to the Radiance series for combat. While designing the levels, the team created both maps with a plot-driven structure and maps that allowed for player freedom in an attempt to add variety to the series and make their design essential to their tale. Another aspect of the battle system, new to the series, was the inclusion of multiple camera options. There was one that appealed to a more classic Fire Emblem style, another that was provided gave a cinematic viewpoint, and a third that added a first-person perspective to the battlefield. Much of this was done with Western players in mind, as the developers wanted to both give players an option on their perspective in battle and demonstrate the platform's 3D effects. Other gameplay elements from the series past entered into the fray as well. Branching promotions from the Sacred Stones made a return, allowing nearly any unit to change their class into something new and unique, making your units all your own. To go along with that, the class swap feature from Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon came back to this new iteration, serving as a way for you to try out different classes and obtain skills you never would have before. Skills, too, were still an important part of gameplay. Since nearly any unit could attain any skill, you were limited to only choosing between 5 of them to keep the game balanced. A world map, just like in Fire Emblem Gaiden, was also implemented, allowing the player to traverse the world and return to old maps for battles, experience, and gold. You could also level up your units, pretty much infinitely too, giving the player another way to set their own difficulty level. There were just so many ways to play that it wasn't Fire Emblem telling you how you had to play, rather, the way you play was your own decision. It was a team effort through and through, with any idea being taken into serious consideration. Fire Emblem Finn was a serious labor of love from true fans of the series from the very beginning. But this ultimate culmination of a project still needed a name, something that was fitting to their situation yet still contained the hope of a success that they yearned for the series to have. It needed to impact anyone who came across it, so Yamagami came up with the idea of Awakening. At the same time, Intelligent Systems knew that this could be the end, while the rest of the world didn't know this. So calling it Awakening meant that the fans wouldn't see it as the same old game they've been playing for years. They would see it as something new. But players still had to play it for that matter, and after 2 years of development in Japan, and a year later for the rest of the world, everyone would then get to see Intelligent Systems' culmination of the entire Fire Emblem franchise. Fire Emblem Awakening, releasing in Japan in 2012 and 2013 globally, was a love letter to the Fire Emblem franchise in more ways than one. Its story was a return to a setting that the series and its creator had failed to return to before. Acania and Valencia. 2,000 years in the future after the events of Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, we find ourselves in the Halidom of Elise, the newly renamed Acania, and it would follow the journey of Chrom, Marth's descendant. But his adventure starts not by his own accord, but by you, the player. As an amnesiac tactician that he finds on the side of the road, you play as the Avatar, or Robin for short. Unlike previous attempts at making a customizable unit, this time the avatar could be tailored to your own tastes, from male to female, to hair color, and even age and voice. There were plenty of possibilities for you to choose from to insert yourself into the Fire Emblem lore. But getting back on track, as you join Crom's army and become his tactician, the group travels throughout Elise, attempting to thwart the advances of the Plagian army, find out the source of the monstrous Risen, confront the origin of your avatar, and save the world from destruction by yet another dark dragon, Grima. In many ways, Awakening was a return to the storytelling of the originals, with an evil wizard and dragon to fight against. But it was oh so much more than that. As a culmination of the series as a whole, other elements were mashed in, such as the series' trademark, morally gray storytelling, and less stereotypical character types that it has developed over time. Majorly, much was brought over from what many consider to be the greatest Fire Emblem title, Genealogy of the Holy War. In turn, they also wished to put something akin to the child storyline into play. They achieved this by adding in a future storyline, dealing with a mysterious character named Marth, who's later revealed to be Lucina, Crom's daughter from a future destroyed by Grima. These new characters, aside from Lucina, are all completely optional units to obtain. Now, whenever two characters reach an S support rank, they will marry and have children. In turn, their child from the future will appear and become recruitable. Based on your various pairings, they also have the potential to look very different from another player's run-through of the game, as whatever child is born is dependent on the mother and their hair color the father, along with differing stats and skills from each. Interestingly enough, Fire Emblem Awakening was also Nintendo's first attempt at paid DLC. Since this could potentially be the last entry in the entire franchise, experimentation had always been a part of its production, and this was no exception. Even after their adventure was over, players could still play for hours on end, further extending Awakening's lifetime past many of its predecessors. There were many different types of maps created for this. Some were made for the purpose of giving players an easy source for experience and money, while others brought back characters from series past, such as Leaf and Alm, essentially beings that took the form of cards that allowed you to bring classic Fire Emblem characters onto the battlefield. Along with future downloadable adventures that expanded on the story, Fire Emblem Awakening was truly a celebration of all things Fire Emblem in more ways than one, and it seems that the whole world took note of this. To save the Fire Emblem franchise, Awakening had to sell at least 250,000 copies in Japan alone, and it achieved that in about 1 week. As the year went on, it doubled that, assuring the series' success. But that wasn't all, as the world still hadn't gotten their hands on this masterpiece. Its release was so incredibly anticipated in the rest of the world that the number of pre-orders placed outstripped the supply that Nintendo thought was acceptable. This was unprecedented for a Fire Emblem title, and especially after its previous lackluster releases, you'd think no one would look forward to their next game. However, because of Nintendo's largest marketing push in Fire Emblem history, Fire Emblem Awakening was plastered all around the world with more coverage than it could ask for. Because of this, Awakening became even more successful outside of Japan, selling nearly 1.5 million copies, a feat reserved for most mainline Nintendo titles. It was also one of the most critically praised titles in all of Fire Emblem, with near perfect scores and reviews about. All the hard work and determination of the team at Intelligent Systems had paid off in droves. What had once been a franchise declining in popularity, with only its fan base to hold it aloft, had now become the most successful entry in the entire franchise, and on the console that it now called home. An amalgamation of everything they had made up until that point. From their complex yet easy to understand battle system, intriguing support conversations, and hardcore difficulties, Fire Emblem Awakening was a game for both the fans and newcomers alike. A demanding series that was near impossible for the majority of people to get into for a time, this brand new entry truly had global appeal. There was nothing stopping anyone from enjoying the franchise for what it is. A franchise filled with a rich assortment of characters, gripping narratives, and fascinating medieval worlds. But now, there was just one problem. The eyes of the world were now watching. Intelligent Systems' next effort had to be a knockout hit that rose above the lofty heights of Awakening once more. The pressure was on, and the true fate of the Fire Emblem series was about to come to light.